I just have one more question, and I know a series of 6 votes has started, and that's why some of my colleagues have, I think, gone back to the floor. One, I want to thank all 3 of you, but my sense, and I liked one of Matt's ideas a lot about all these of the 300, it used to be 360,000, I think we're down to 320,000 Chinese students. Give every one of those students an American phone when they got here, so they are not surveilled constantly. But my sense of the Chinese economy, and one of the challenges we have, frankly, for any American, or for that matter, Western-based company, and I would point out that while this committee, I think, got ahead of the game a little bit on spotting 5G, it really came, the first signs of warning about Huawei didn't actually come as much from the intelligence community, came from places like Japan and South Korea and elsewhere. But it seems to me that the Chinese economy has allowed, and I don't know if that's changing dramatically now as we see the leadership and some of the value taken out of some of the most successful tech companies in these last few months. But for last 5 to 10 years, China would allow a ferocious level of competition, at least within the tech space. But that competition would be allowed until a national champion emerges, well, a la Huawei or ZTE. And once that, and in that space, no Western, no American, for that matter, any Western company could actually be on the competitive edge. There would never be allowed a Western or American company to kind of win in one of these new technology areas. Matter of fact, as we know, with Facebook being excluded, or Google trying for a while and then leaving on their own accord, and others. And the idea that Chinese technology winner then suddenly, even if they're independent, gets the full backing of the state, well, we've talked about $100 billion plus, is really an economic model, kind of an authoritarian capitalism model, that I don't like, but it's had a pretty successful record recently. Because if you then combine that not only with the financial support, but also with the Belt and Road Initiative, the Digital Silk Road, China's increasing power around the world, you suddenly had a series of, well, maybe not satellite countries in the traditional mindset, at least countries that were dependent on China's forbearance because China happened to be also building a bridge or building a road in many of those countries. I think that model is hard to compete against. I think we've seen it as well, and I think this committee spent a lot of time looking around this issue, which I raised in my opening comments, around standards and rules of the game, again, within technology. Because I would argue that, again, I use the Sputnik example, but post-Sputnik, virtually every major technology innovation over the last 60 years, if it wasn't invented in America, we still got to set the rules and the standards and the protocols. And those rules, whether it was about transparency or respect for human rights, even in technology standards, you can embed some of your standards. It kind of crept up on us in 5G, and I say this as an old telecom guy, where suddenly China was flooding the zone on these international standard-setting bodies with engineers, with power, and they are, I would argue in many ways, on the 5G issue, they won the standard-setting component. And unfortunately, we're seeing, whether it's in AI or facial recognition or a host of areas where they have now had the audacity to lay out with a great deal of specificity where they hope to dominate, they are being fairly successful. So the question I have for all 3 of you, and my last question is, I don't believe we can do this alone. I think some of our greatest strengths has been our alliances, that there is a moment in time where not just Five Eyes or not just NATO, but our democracies around the world. I would even argue that we may be entering in an era where post-World War II was an era of military alliances, NATO, CETO, a series of others. 60s and 70s of last century started European Union being a classic example of economic alliances. I think in 2021 and going forward, we need to think about technology-based alliances. And those and those alliances ought to be based upon democracies who share those same sets of values and goals of democracy. And that needs to start in areas like standard setting. It is where we have actually finally put our money where our mouth is in terms of recent legislation that virtually everybody on this committee supported around support for semiconductors. And we did get a smaller slug in for 5G and O-RAN. But I'd ask all three of you, and I'll start, Anna, with you, then go to Bill, and then let Matt close out. How should we think about this effort to get our allies better engaged with us as partners, not into this bifurcation choice that you either got to be on our side or China's side, but do this in some level of collaboration around technology development, around standard setting, around, again, promoting a very alternative model to the authoritarian communism model, or authoritarian capitalism model that China has frankly practiced fairly well.
Thank you, Senator. You raised some really important points. I want to highlight the model that you described is one that China has laid out for its strategic emerging industries. It's winning the China market first, creating that national champion, and then having that go out and compete on the world stage. And talking about Huawei, I think, is a great example of that. What it highlights are those areas and what are those characteristics of these different industries where profit margins, national security, in some ways, go in opposite directions. And how do we actually compete with that? Because those industrial policies of our like-mindeds are very, very different in scale, scope, and flavor than what we're seeing with China. Forming those tech alliances will be, in my opinion, are very, very important. And it's looking out across how do we can't out China, let's face it. But we don't want to. We want to double down on the advantages of our own system. And that is working with our partners and allies in building those innovation hubs, finding those niche areas. Some countries will be set for tech alliances in certain areas, some in different technologies. But it's also, I think, it's part of that information sharing and risk calculation sharing that we should have those dialogues about what's at stake and how we can use technology that are in line with our values and the values of our allies and partners.
Thank you. Bill?
Senator, first, thanks for having this hearing. I think it's really important for the American public to understand the issues that you and the Vice Chair brought to the openness since we hadn't closed hearings for a few years. I think your premise is right on our need to cooperate and collaborate with our allies. However, I will proffer that we need to lead in that collaboration. I think with respect to my colleague Anna's point, China's not going to change. And I think if there's one thing in D.C. that we have bipartisan support on is that China is going to be China and they're going to double down. We have to make a decision in America. Do we want to change the way we operate? We clearly are bifurcated for the right reasons between the government and the private sector. I would proffer it's time to change the way we look at that and really look at how we are willing to change the construct for partnering with private sector, industry, technology to be able to build coalitions between our government first in industry and then show that leadership to our allies in Europe and other places so they could use that as a framework. We won that argument with Huawei for the same reason. I think the next step with technology is to do the same methodology, find champions in the U.S. and have the government partner with so that we look at China as a competitor, not just as an enemy, and we can compete, because we can't compete because we're America, and we will win if we may put our mind to it. Secondarily, as we did with Huawei, other countries and allies will watch and learn and do the same methodology in their own country to do the same diplomatic and technological solution. So I do think we have an opportunity here with allies if we change the way we do business here in the U.S.
Very good. Matt, and recognizing I've got to go run vote in a moment.
You bet. Thanks, Senator. Very quickly, I agree with you. I think your vision for these sort of coalitions around certain technologies, coalitions of the willing, if you like, is the way that we need to go. And there's precedent for that. During the Cold War, we had what was called the Coordinating Committee, where industry in Japan and the United States and other allied countries made sure that the Soviet Union didn't gain access to our most cutting-edge semiconductor technology. Here we are again, and it's the same technology, it's semiconductors. We've got to win that race. Commerce needs to be brought firmly into the fold. The Bureau of Industry and Security has to be really treated and think like a national security arm of the U.S. government, not a trade promotion arm, if we're going to win on semiconductors. We've got to make peace with the Europeans on these privacy issues and these things that we're tied up with. Right now, the Europeans are very inconsistent in how they're viewing privacy. They're targeting American technology giants, but they're not applying the same standards to Chinese companies, which are going to be truly harmful to the interests of Europeans and disrespectful of people's privacy of their data and so forth. So that's an area where we need to break through. But I think I agree with you with those kinds of coalitions, even if it's not one neat global approach, but one of different coalitions. I think we're unbeatable.
Well, thank you all. I'm just two quick last comments. One, to not just American industry, but all of the Western industry that is invested in China. We can no problem with that, as long as it's not at the price of your values, as long as you do not surrender to, as Senator Rubio pointed out, that you turn a blind eye to human rights abuses, or you are willing to be co-opted into taking policies that you would not take, not only in the United States, but for that matter, any other country in the world. That we have to be constantly consistent on. And I think the business community needs to continue to hear these messages in these open settings and as appropriate in closed settings as well, so even further information can be shared. And then last point, and I, again, very much appreciate all three of the witnesses that in your opening statements you all hit on this point, and that is that this beef, our concern, our challenge is with the Communist Party of China and its leadership. And any forces in this country that instead play into broad-based racist or xenophobic statements about the Chinese people, the Chinese diaspora, Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, frankly, do a disservice to our country and our values, but also play right in to the CCP's agenda that you can never be, that the only place you will ever have a firm and permanent home is back in China. I think we, and I say this here for speaking on behalf of all the senators on this dais who are here today, need to redouble our efforts to make that distinction and to make sure that, particularly law enforcement, and I've spent a lot of time with Director Wray on this issue, that the FBI and others reach out on a very regular basis to the Chinese American diaspora in this country. They are under, as so many, Bill, as you've made comments, under a level of pressure sometimes that is extraordinary. And they are great Americans. They've contributed enormously to our country, but we need them in this challenge against the Communist Party's ideology. And and any observant person, doesn't need, I don't think, further proof, because you see the very nature of the treatment of the Uyghurs or the treatment of the people of Hong Kong. We need to keep that lesson and continue to make that point.